Is this child? Why does she look like me? Connor Blake's voice faltered, barely a whisper, as he steadied the little girl who'd collided with him in the Peninsula Hotel's glittering ballroom. Simone Brooks glided through the crowd, her confidence unshakable until her eyes met his, her ex, the billionaire whose betrayal shattered her world. Zoe, her daughter, tugged at her hand, oblivious to the storm brewing. Simone, he breathed, stunned by her radiance. Connor, she replied, icy, dismissing him. Mama Cupcake, Zoe chirped, and Simone led her away, leaving Connor reeling. What secret binds them after 8 years? Will truth unravel their past or deepen the wounds? A tale of betrayal, pride, and hidden bonds awaits the peninsula. Hotel's grand ballroom pulsed with opulence, a kaleidoscope of crystal chandeliers casting golden light across silk-draped tables, the air heavy with the scent of roses and the hum of laughter. Simone Brooks wove through the throng, her presence a quiet command, her burgundy velvet gown catching whispers of light with every step. She was here for Maya, her oldest friend, whose wedding was a beacon of joy in a city that held only ghosts for Simone. Her heart, though steady, thrummed with unease. New York was a map of old wounds, each corner a reminder of a love she'd buried. Zoe, her daughter, clung to her hand, her lavender dress swaying as she craned her neck toward the dessert table, its tiers of cupcakes a child's paradise. Mama, can I have one? Zoe's voice sparkled, a bright note against the jazz weaving through the room. Simone's lips curved, a warmth reserved only for her daughter softening her guarded edges. Just one, sweetheart. Then we find Auntie Maya. Zoe broke free, her small frame darting forward with the reckless joy only a child could muster. The moment was shattered in an instant. Zoe, caught in her eagerness, collided with a man's legs, her juice cup tilting precariously. A steady hand caught her, his low chuckle cutting through the din. Careful, little one. His voice, familiar as a half-forgotten dream, sent a jolt through Simone's core. She hurried forward, her pulse spiking. Zoe, watch out. The words died on her lips as she met his eyes. Connor Blake, the man who'd once held her heart, now a billionaire whose name echoed in headlines. His charcoal suit was impeccable, but it was the raw shock in his blue eyes that pinned her in place. Simone, he breathed, the word a fragile thread stretched across years of silence. She straightened, her poise a fortress, her beauty a silent defiance against the storm brewing inside. Connor, she replied, her voice cold as winter, slicing through the warmth of the celebration. She knelt to adjust Zoe's dress, her touch deliberate, dismissing him as if he were no more than a passing stranger. Connor's chest constricted, her indifference a blade twisting in a wound he thought had scarred over. She was more radiant than he remembered, her presence a fire that both drew and burned him. Who's this? He asked, his voice tight, eyes locked on Zoe. My daughter Zoe, Simone said, her hand firm on Zoe's shoulder, protective, unyielding. Zoe grinned up at him, her innocence a stark contrast to the tension crackling between the adults. Sorry for bumping you, mister. Connor crouched, his gaze tracing her features, her sharp cheekbones, the curve of her brows, a mirror of his own. His breath caught, a realization clawing at the edges of his mind. How old are you, Zoe? He asked, his voice barely steady. 7, she chirped, her smile bright. My birthday's coming soon. The word landed like a stone, sinking into the depths of Connor's heart. 7 years. The math was relentless, dragging him back to their last night together, when love had felt eternal. His eyes flicked to Simone, searching for confirmation, but her gaze was a wall, impenetrable. Simone, we need to talk, he said, standing, his tone firm but laced with a desperation he couldn't mask. She met his eyes unflinching, her voice a blade of ice. Not here. This is Maya's day. She guided Zoe toward the dance floor, her steps measured, leaving Connor rooted to the spot, the room's revelry a cruel mockery of the chaos within him. He watched them go, Simone's grace cutting through the crowd like a beacon, Zoe's small hand nestled in hers. His mind churned, piecing together the impossible. 7 years. Zoe's face was a haunting echo of his own, a truth he couldn't unsee. He'd loved Simone once, with a fierceness that consumed him, until his mother's lies and his own rage tore it apart. Now, in this glittering cage of celebration, the weight of that betrayal pressed down, the possibility of a daughter he never knew clawing at his soul. Connor's hand trembled as he reached for a champagne flute, the liquid burning his throat but doing nothing to dull the ache. He scanned the room, catching Maya's silhouette, radiant in her bridal gown, laughing with guests. She'd invited them both. Had she planned this? His phone buzzed, a text from a mutual friend. Maya said she'd be here. You holding up? His jaw clenched. Maya had orchestrated this collision, a calculated spark in a powder keg of history. He set the glass down, resolve hardening. He wouldn't let Simone slip away again, not without answers. Simone knelt beside Zoe on the dance floor, tying a loose ribbon on her dress as the girl twirled, oblivious to the storm in her mother's chest. It's so pretty, Mama. Zoe's voice was a lifeline, grounding Simone against the tide of memories, threatening to pull her under. Her eyes darted to Connor, still by the dessert table, his gaze a weight she couldn't shake. She'd rebuilt herself after he shattered her, raising Zoe alone, forging a life of strength and love. His reappearance was a crack in that armor, but she refused to let it break her. Stay close, baby, she murmured, guiding Zoe toward a cluster of children. The jazz swelled, its notes pricking at her heart. Memories of nights when Connor's arms were her haven, his laughter her home. She shoved the thought down, locking it away. He'd chosen his mother's lies over her, and she'd chosen survival. Yet the way he looked at Zoe, with a softness she'd once known, stirred a flicker of something she refused to name: anger, fear, or worse, longing. Connor took a step toward them, then stopped, the ballroom suddenly too small, the air too thick. He remembered Simone's warmth, the way she'd made his world brighter, and the fury that had consumed him when he thought she'd betrayed him. His mother's words, her fabricated evidence, had been a poison he drank without question. Now Zoe's existence was a beacon, illuminating a truth he'd been too blind to see: his daughter. The word echoed, a wound and a hope intertwined. He caught Maya's eye across the room, her nod a silent confirmation of her role in this reunion. Anger flared, but it was drowned by a deeper need: to understand, to bridge the chasm he'd helped create. He moved toward the balcony doors, the night air a promise of clarity. 5 minutes, Simone, he whispered to himself, knowing she wouldn't come easily. But he'd wait. For Zoe, for the truth, for the woman he'd lost. Simone felt his gaze linger as she led Zoe to the children's area, her fingers tightening around her daughter's hand. She'd faced worse than this: years of solitude, of building a life from ashes. Connor Blake, with his wealth and his regrets, was just a shadow from her past, one she wouldn't let darken her future. Yet as Zoe laughed, spinning with other children, Simone's heart betrayed her, whispering a question she refused to answer. What if? The echoes of the ballroom's jazz faded as Simone's silhouette vanished into the crowd, Zoe's laughter a fleeting melody that lingered in Connor Blake's ears. He stood frozen by the dessert table, the weight of her icy dismissal pressing against his chest like a stone. The peninsula's opulence, with its gilded light and clinking glasses, felt like a mockery of the storm raging within him. Simone's face, radiant, unyielding, had stirred a fire he thought long extinguished, but it was Zoe's eyes, a mirror of his own, that tore open wounds he'd buried. 7 years. The truth clawed at him, relentless, demanding to be faced. He pushed through the throng, the chatter of guests a dull roar against the pulse in his temples. The balcony doors loomed ahead, a promise of air to clear the fog of shock. He stepped into the night, the New York skyline sprawling below, its lights sharp and cold as his thoughts. His hands gripped the railing, knuckles whitening. Zoe was his daughter. He felt it in his bones, in the ache that spread with every heartbeat. But Simone's words, sharp as glass, echoed louder. Not here. This is Maya's day. Her voice had been a blade, cutting through any hope of reconciliation. Yet he couldn't shake the image of her standing tall, her strength a wall he couldn't breach. Inside, Simone knelt beside Zoe, who twirled among the children, her lavender dress catching the light. Mama, can I dance more? Zoe's voice was bright, untouched by the shadows that clung to her mother. Simone forced a smile, her fingers brushing Zoe's shoulder, grounding herself in the one truth that mattered, her daughter's happiness. But Connor's presence was a specter, stirring memories she'd locked away. His shock, the way his eyes softened on Zoe, pricked at her heart, a heart she'd hardened against him long ago. She wouldn't let him unravel the life she'd built, not after the pain he'd caused. Her mind slipped back, unbidden, to a night heavy with rain in a Manhattan apartment that once felt like home. The memory was vivid, as if the years hadn't dulled its edges. Connor had stormed in, his face twisted with fury, his voice a weapon. "You're nothing but a lying whore, Simone," he'd spat, each word a lash. "A filthy gold digger trying to trap me with someone else's child. I trusted you, and you played me." The accusations had come like thunder, fueled by his mother's lies. Evelyn Blake's voice still haunted her. "You're not one of us. Leave, or your family will suffer." Simone had been summoned to a sleek, sterile restaurant days earlier, Evelyn's cold eyes dissecting her. "Your blood will never taint our legacy," she'd said, her threats precise, destroying her mother's bakery, her brother's career, her future. Simone, newly pregnant, had stood firm, refusing Evelyn's money, but the weight of those threats had crushed her resolve. She tried to explain to Connor, her voice breaking. "It's not true, Connor, please." But he'd cut her off, his eyes burning with disgust. "Get out! I never want to see you again." The words had shattered her, each one a dagger to the love they'd built. She'd packed her bags, tears blurring her vision, and fled to Atlanta, vowing to protect the child growing inside her. She'd left a letter for him, poured her heart onto the page. "I'm carrying your child, Connor. I loved you. Why didn't you trust me?" But it never reached him, swallowed by Evelyn's machinations. That betrayal, his and his mother's, had forged Simone's strength, a steel forged in pain. Now in the ballroom, that strength held her upright as she watched Zoe giggle with other children. But her chest ached, the memory of Connor's venomous words, a wound that refused to heal. She'd rebuilt her life, brick by brick, for Zoe, a life of love, stability, pride. Connor's reappearance was a crack in that foundation, but she wouldn't let it crumble. She glanced toward the balcony, where he'd vanished, and felt a flicker of something dangerous. Anger, yes, but beneath it, a whisper of the love she'd once felt. She crushed it, her jaw tightening. He'd chosen lies over her. She owed him nothing. Connor leaned against the balcony railing, the city's pulse a distant hum. The champagne flute he'd grabbed sat untouched, its bubbles mocking his turmoil. Zoe's face flashed in his mind, her smile, her brows, a reflection of his own. He'd been blind, consumed by his mother's poison. Evelyn had shown him texts, photos, a fabricated tale of Simone's betrayal. "She's after your money, Connor," she'd said, her voice smooth as venom. "The child isn't yours." He'd believed her, his trust in Simone shattered by rage. He'd confronted her, his words cruel, unforgivable. The memory of her tears, her broken pleas, haunted him now, a ghost he couldn't outrun. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his mistake suffocating. He'd spent years drowning in work, building an empire to fill the void Simone left. But seeing her tonight, radiant and unyielding, had cracked that facade. And Zoe, his daughter, he was certain, had ignited a longing he didn't know he could feel. He wanted to know her, to be more than a stranger she'd bumped into. But Simone's coldness was a wall, her eyes a fortress he'd helped build with his own hands. Inside, Simone rose, guiding Zoe toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. The music swelled, a jazzy melody that tugged at her heart. Nights when Connor would hum along, his arms around her, their laughter a shared secret. She shoved the memory down, her fingers tightening around Zoe's hand. "Let's find Auntie Maya, okay?" she said, her voice steady despite the storm within. Zoe nodded, oblivious to the tension, her small hand warm in Simone's. But as they moved, Simone felt Connor's gaze, a weight that followed her through the crowd. She wouldn't look back. She couldn't. Connor stepped back into the ballroom, the light blinding after the night's embrace. He scanned the room, finding Simone and Zoe near the bridal party. Maya caught his eye, her smile faltering as she registered his expression. She'd planned this, he was sure, inviting them both, knowing the truth would surface. Anger flared, but it was drowned by a deeper need. Answers, redemption, a chance to undo the past. He took a step forward, then stopped. The distance between him and Simone more than physical. Her indifference was a punishment he deserved, but Zoe's existence was a truth he couldn't ignore. Simone felt him watching, her skin prickling under the weight of his gaze. She knelt to whisper to Zoe, her daughter's laughter a shield against the chaos he'd stirred. She'd faced worse than this. Years of raising Zoe alone, of building a life from nothing. Connor Blake, with his wealth and his regrets, was a shadow she'd left behind. Yet as Zoe twirled, her joy alight in the room, Simone's heart betrayed her with a question. What if she'd told him the truth all those years ago? She pushed it away, her resolve ironclad. He'd broken her once. She wouldn't let him do it again. The music shifted, a slower tune that wrapped the room in intimacy. Connor's throat tightened as he watched Simone and Zoe, a tableau of love he'd been excluded from. He'd lost her to his own blindness, his mother's lies. But Zoe, his daughter, was a chance to make things right, even if Simone never forgave him. He moved toward the edge of the dance floor, his heart a battleground of hope and regret. He'd wait, as long as it took, for a chance to know the girl with his eyes, and the woman who still held a piece of his soul. The jazz from the ballroom drifted faintly through the balcony doors, a haunting melody that curled around Simone Brooks like a memory she couldn't shake. She stood alone, the New York skyline sprawling below, its lights sharp and unforgiving against the night. Zoe was safe with Maya's nieces, her laughter a distant echo that anchored Simone's resolve. But Connor's presence, his desperate plea for answers, had cracked the armor she'd worn for years. Her fingers gripped the balcony railing, the cool metal grounding her against the storm of emotions threatening to break free. She'd come here for Maya's joy, not to face the man who'd shattered her heart. Yet here she was, drawn to this confrontation by a force she couldn't name. Connor stepped onto the balcony, his silhouette framed by the doorway, the weight of his gaze heavier than the city's hum. His charcoal suit was still pristine, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, betrayed a turmoil that matched her own. "She's mine, isn't she?" he asked, his voice low, raw with a certainty that made Simone's breath catch. The question hung between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of years and pain. She wanted to turn away, to let her silence be her answer, but the truth demanded to be spoken. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded like a war drum. The word landed like a stone, and Connor's face crumpled, a mix of awe and anguish. He took a step closer, his hands clenching, as if to hold on to the revelation. 8 years, Simone," he said, his voice cracking. "You kept my daughter from me." The accusation stung, igniting a fire in her chest that she'd kept banked for too long. She spun to face him, her eyes blazing, her poise a weapon honed by survival. "Your mother made sure I had no choice," she shot back, her words sharp as glass. "She called me to that sterile restaurant, looked at me like I was dirt and told me I'd never be one of you. She threatened my family, my mother's bakery, my brother's job, my entire future. Said she'd ruin us if I stayed. And you," her voice trembled, but she forced it steady, each word a blade. "You believed her lies. You called me a whore, Connor, a gold digger carrying another man's child. You spat in my face and told me to get out. Do you know what that did to me? I was pregnant, alone, and you broke me." Connor flinched as if her words were physical blows, his face paling under the moonlight. "She showed me texts, photos," he said, his voice hoarse, pleading. "Said you were cheating, that the baby wasn't mine. I was furious, blindsided. I thought you'd betrayed me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of despair Simone remembered from quieter days. "I didn't know, Simone. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she countered, her voice like steel, cutting through his excuses. "You chose her over me. You looked at me like I was nothing, screamed I was filth. I stood there begging you to listen, and you threw me out like trash." Her eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. She'd cried enough for him, for the love they'd lost. I wrote you a letter, poured my heart out, told you about the baby. You never answered. I thought you didn't care. A letter? Connor's voice broke, his eyes wide with shock. I never got it. Simone, He stopped, his hands trembling. My mother. She must have. His words trailed off, the realization a fresh wound. Simone's laugh was bitter, a sound that carried years of pain. Of course she did. She made sure I was erased from your life, and you let her. The truth hung heavy between them, the moonlight casting their shadows long and jagged. Connor took another step closer, his voice soft, desperate. I was wrong, Simone. I've hated myself every day for what I said, for what I believed. I thought you'd left me, that you'd moved on. But seeing Zoe, seeing you, he swallowed, his eyes glistening. I need her. And you. I never stopped loving you. The confession was a plea, raw and unguarded, but it only deepened the ache in Simone's chest. She stepped back, the distance between them a chasm no words could bridge. That love died when you called me a whore, she said, her voice cold, final. You don't get to walk back into our lives, Connor. Zoe is happy, brilliant, and loved. We don't need you. Each word was a brick in the wall she'd built around her heart, a defense against the man who'd once been her everything. Connor's face twisted, pain and longing warring in his expression. But I need her, he whispered. And you. Please, Simone. She shook her head, her resolve ironclad. You lost that right when you chose lies over me. She turned toward the ballroom, the jazz swelling as if to pull her back to safety. But before she could leave, Connor's voice stopped her. I saw the necklace on Zoe, he said, his tone urgent. The one I gave you with the star pendant. You kept it. You gave it to her. Simone froze, her heart stuttering. She'd forgotten the necklace, a gift from a time when love felt possible. Zoe wore it tonight, a small piece of her past she couldn't let go. It doesn't mean anything, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. But the necklace was a crack in her armor, a reminder of the nights they'd spent dreaming under the stars. She pushed the memory down, turning to face him one last time. Stay away from us, Connor. She walked back into the ballroom, her steps steady despite the tremor in her chest. Zoe's laughter greeted her, a lifeline pulling her from the abyss. Connor remained on the balcony, the city's lights blurring as his eyes stung. The necklace had been a spark of hope, proof that Simone had held on to a piece of him, even after everything. But her words, we don't need you, were a verdict, a punishment he couldn't escape. He'd believed his mother's lies, let his anger destroy the woman he loved. Now Zoe's existence was a truth he couldn't unsee, a daughter he longed to know. But Simone's strength, her unyielding resolve, was a wall he didn't know how to climb. Inside, Simone rejoined Zoe, kneeling to tie a ribbon that had come loose. Having fun, baby? She asked, her voice soft, hiding the storm within. Zoe nodded, her smile bright. Can we dance more, Mama? Simone forced a smile, her heart heavy. Connor's confession echoed in her mind, stirring a flicker of doubt. Had he truly not known? The necklace, Zoe's innocent joy, tugged at her, but the memory of his venom, whore, gold digger, was louder. She'd built a life without him, a fortress of love for Zoe. She wouldn't let him breach it. The music shifted, a slower tune wrapping the room in warmth. Simone guided Zoe to the dance floor, her daughter's hand warm in hers. She felt Connor's presence somewhere behind her, a shadow she refused to acknowledge. She'd faced worse than this. Years of solitude, of proving herself against a world that tried to break her. Connor Blake was just a ghost, one she'd banished long ago. Yet as Zoe spun, her laughter a melody of innocence, a question lingered in Simone's heart. Could she keep the truth from her daughter forever? The jazz notes from the ballroom lingered in Simone Brooks' ears as she sat in a quiet corner of a small Atlanta cafe, the morning light filtering through smudged windows. Zoe, her daughter, sat across from her, coloring a star chart with fierce concentration, her lavender dress from the wedding replaced by a simple sweater. The peninsula's grandeur felt like a distant dream, but the weight of Connor Blake's words on the balcony clung to Simone like a shadow. His confession, "I never stopped loving you," had pierced her defenses, stirring a storm of anger and buried longing. She gripped her coffee mug, its warmth a frail anchor against the chaos threatening to unravel her carefully built life. Zoe hummed softly, unaware of the turmoil in her mother's heart. "Mama, can I show Auntie Maya my stars?" she asked, holding up her drawing. Simone forced a smile, her voice steady despite the ache. "Sure, baby, she'll love it." But her eyes darted to the cafe door, half expecting Connor to appear, his presence a specter she couldn't shake. She'd left him on that balcony, his plea for a chance echoing in the night. But the memory of his betrayal, those venomous words, whore, gold digger, kept her resolve ironclad. She'd raised Zoe alone, built a fortress of love and strength. He had no place in it. A knock at the cafe door jolted her. Connor stood there, a tray of breakfast in his hands, pancakes drizzled with syrup, fresh fruit, and a small juice for Zoe. His charcoal suit was gone, replaced by a simple jacket, but his blue eyes carried the same raw intensity. Zoe's face lit up. "Pancakes!" she squealed, clapping her hands. Connor's smile was hesitant, a flicker of hope in the face of Simone's guarded stare. "Thought you might like these," he said, setting the tray down. Simone's jaw tightened, her instinct to push him away warring with the warmth in Zoe's eyes. "Thank you, mister," Zoe said, already reaching for a pancake. Connor knelt beside her, his gaze softening as she chattered about her pet turtle, Newton, and her dream of flying to the stars. "Newton's the best turtle ever," she declared. "He hides in his shell when he's shy, but I tell him stories about space." Connor's laugh was soft, genuine, and it stabbed at Simone's heart. A sound she'd once loved, now laced with pain. She watched, silent, as he listened to Zoe, his eyes tracing her features, the same cheekbones he saw in the mirror. Each word from Zoe was a thread pulling him closer to a daughter he'd never known, and it tore at Simone's resolve. She stood abruptly, her voice clipped. "Zoe, eat quickly. We need to go." But before she could steer her daughter away, Maya slipped into the cafe, her bridal glow dimmed by a heavy expression. "Simone, can we talk?" she asked, glancing at Connor warily. Simone nodded, guiding Zoe to a nearby table with her coloring book. Maya sat, her hands fidgeting. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice low. "After you left New York, I tried to tell Connor the truth. I went to his office, told him you were pregnant, and that his mother lied. Evelyn was there. She threatened to sue me for defamation, said she'd ruin my career if I didn't stay silent. I backed off. I'm so sorry." Simone's breath caught, the revelation a fresh wound. "You saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Maya nodded. "He was a wreck, Simone. But Evelyn had him convinced you'd betrayed him. I should have fought harder." The words hung heavy, a new layer of betrayal. Simone's hands clenched, the memory of Evelyn's cold voice. "Your blood will never taint our legacy," mixing with Connor's venom. "You're a lying whore." She'd carried that pain alone, believing no one had tried to help. Now Maya's confession cracked her carefully guarded heart, stirring a flicker of doubt. Had Connor truly been blind to the truth? She glanced at him, still kneeling by Zoe, his eyes soft as he listened to her daughter's chatter. A memory flashed, nights when he'd read to her, his voice a comfort in their tiny apartment. She shoved it down, her anger flaring. "It doesn't change anything," she said to Maya, her voice steady but laced with pain. "He believed her. He called me filth, told me to get out. I rebuilt my life for Zoe. He doesn't get to walk back in." Maya's eyes glistened. "I know, but he tried to find you, Simone. Evelyn blocked him at every turn, changed his email passwords, screened his calls. He didn't know." Simone's chest tightened, the weight of Maya's words pressing against her resolve. She wanted to scream, to let the pain of those years spill out. But Zoe's laughter tethered her. She looked at her daughter, blissfully unaware, and felt a surge of protectiveness. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Maya, her voice cold. "But it's too late." She stood, ready to leave, but Connor's voice stopped her. "Simone, please," he said, standing, his eyes pleading. I want to be part of her life. I'll do anything. Her gaze met his, unyielding. You had your chance, she said, each word a brick in the wall between them. You chose lies over me. Zoe and I are enough. The words were a shield protecting the life she'd built, but they cost her, each one a reminder of the love she'd lost. Connor's face crumpled, his hands trembling as he fought for words. I didn't know about the letter, he said, his voice raw. I didn't know about her. I swear, Simone, if I'd known. You didn't ask, she cut him off, her voice like ice. You looked at me like I was nothing. That's what I carry, Connor, not your regrets. She turned to Zoe, who was happily munching a pancake. Come on, baby, we're going. Zoe pouted but gathered her star chart, waving at Connor. Thanks for the pancakes, mister. Her innocence was a knife, twisting in both their hearts. Connor watched them leave, the cafe door swinging shut like a verdict. He sank into a chair, Maya's revelation echoing in his mind. Evelyn had orchestrated it all, her lies, her threats, her iron grip on his life. He'd let her poison his trust in Simone, let his anger destroy the only woman he'd ever loved. Zoe's laughter, her stories about turtles and stars, was a glimpse of a life he'd been denied. He wanted to know her, to be more than a stranger bearing pancakes. But Simone's words, "We don't need you," were a wall he couldn't scale. Simone led Zoe down the street, her daughter's hand warm in hers. Maya's words churned in her mind, a storm she couldn't quiet. Connor had tried to find her, had been blocked by Evelyn's cruelty. A part of her wanted to believe him, to see the man who'd once loved her in the way he looked at Zoe. But the memory of his voice, "You're a lying whore," was louder, a wound that hadn't healed. She'd built a life for Zoe, a fortress of love and pride. She wouldn't let Connor's regrets weaken it. As Zoe skipped beside her, chattering about stars, Simone felt a pang of doubt. What if she'd fought harder to reach him? What if Zoe deserved to know her father? She pushed the thoughts away, her heart a locked vault. She'd survived worse than this, and she'd survived Connor Blake. But as they turned the corner, the weight of his gaze lingered, a ghost she couldn't outrun. The Atlanta sun dipped low, painting the small park near Simone Brooks' home in hues of amber and gold. Zoe's laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly across the grass, her sweater catching the evening breeze. Simone sat on a weathered bench, her coffee gone cold, her heart a tangle of resolve and unease. The sting of Maya's revelation in the cafe lingered like a bruise. Connor had tried to find her, blocked by his mother's cruelty. But his words from years ago, whore, gold digger, still echoed, a poison that kept her guard up. She'd built a life for Zoe, a sanctuary of love and strength, and she wouldn't let Connor's shadow breach it. Zoe bounded over, her eyes bright. Mama, look, a monarch! She held out her hands, mimicking wings, oblivious to the storm in her mother's chest. Simone smiled, the warmth of her daughter's joy a lifeline. Beautiful, baby, she said, brushing a stray leaf from Zoe's sweater. But her gaze drifted to the park's edge, half expecting Connor's silhouette. Since the cafe, he'd kept his distance, but his presence lingered in the gifts he sent through Maya. A book on constellations, a tiny model spaceship. Each one chipped at Simone's resolve, stirring a question she refused to answer. Could Zoe have a father without reopening her own wounds? A rustle in the grass pulled her from her thoughts. Connor emerged, his jacket casual but his eyes heavy with purpose. Zoe spotted him, her face lighting up. Mr. Connor, she called, running over. Simone's stomach twisted, her instinct to pull Zoe back, warring with the delight in her daughter's voice. Connor knelt, pulling a small box from his pocket. Got something for you, Zoe, he said, his voice soft. Inside was a star chart, its edges worn as if he'd held it too long. Thought you'd like to map the sky. Zoe's gasp was pure joy. Can I show Mama? She clutched the chart, racing to Simone. Look, Mama, it's got Orion. Simone's throat tightened, the name stirring memories of nights when she and Connor had lain on a rooftop, tracing constellations, dreaming of a future that never came. She forced a nod, her voice steady. It's lovely, sweetheart. But her eyes met Connor's, and the weight of his gaze, hopeful, pleading, felt like a current pulling her under. He stood, hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain. "I saw her school fairs coming up," he said, his voice low. "I'd like to be there, Simone. For her." The request was a spark in dry grass, igniting her anger. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her tone sharp but quiet, mindful of Zoe nearby. "You don't know her, Connor. You don't know us." His face crumpled, pain flashing in his eyes. "I want to," he said, his voice raw. "I've missed everything. Her first steps, her first words. I didn't know, Simone. I swear I didn't." Her chest ached, Maya's words echoing. Evelyn blocked him at every turn, but the memory of his venom was louder. "You called me a liar," she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "You said I was filth, trying to trap you. I was pregnant, alone, and you threw me out. You don't get to walk back in because you're sorry." Her words were a wall, each one a brick laid to protect her heart. Connor's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "I was wrong, he said. "I believed my mother's lies. I've hated myself every day since." Simone's fingers clenched, the star chart in Zoe's hands a cruel reminder of what they'd lost. She wanted to scream, to let the pain of those years spill out, but Zoe's laughter tethered her. "Mama, can we find Orion tonight?" Zoe asked, oblivious to the tension. Simone knelt, forcing a smile. "We'll try, baby." She stood, facing Connor, her voice cold. "Stay away, Connor. We don't need your gifts or your guilt." She took Zoe's hand, leading her toward the playground, but the weight of his presence lingered, a ghost she couldn't banish. Connor watched them go, the park's golden light fading as his heart sank. Zoe's joy over the star chart had been a glimpse of a life he'd been denied, a daughter who loved the stars, just as he once had with Simone. He remembered their nights under the sky, her laughter as she named constellations, her warmth against him. But he'd destroyed that, let his mother's lies poison his trust. The star chart was a small offering, a desperate attempt to bridge the years he'd lost. Simone's rejection, sharp and final, was a punishment he deserved, but it didn't dull the longing to know Zoe, to be more than a stranger bearing gifts. He lingered in the park, watching Zoe climb a slide, Simone's protective gaze never wavering. His phone buzzed, a message from Maya. "I gave her your letter." She didn't open it. His throat tightened. He'd poured his heart into that letter, an apology for the words that haunted him, a plea for a chance to know Zoe. But Simone's refusal was a verdict, one he couldn't argue. He'd believed Evelyn's fabricated texts, her photos, her lies about Simone's betrayal. He'd let his anger destroy the only woman he'd ever loved, and now her strength, her unyielding resolve, was a wall he couldn't climb. Simone sat back on the bench, Zoe's laughter a balm against the turmoil in her chest. The star chart lay beside her, its edges creased from Zoe's eager hands. She traced a finger over it, her heart betraying her with a memory. Connor pointing to Orion, his voice soft, promising forever. She'd believed him then, but his betrayal had taught her better. Maya's revelation had cracked her certainty, suggesting he hadn't known the truth, but his words, "You're a lying whore," were a wound that refused to heal. She'd rebuilt her life for Zoe, a fortress of love and pride. Connor's gifts, his presence, threatened to shake that foundation, but she wouldn't let them. Zoe ran back, her cheeks flushed. "Mama, can we get ice cream?" Simone smiled, the question pulling her from the abyss. "Sure, baby." She stood, taking Zoe's hand, but her eyes lingered on Connor, still standing at the park's edge. His gaze was a weight, pleading, broken. A part of her wanted to believe his regret, to let Zoe have the father she deserved. But the memory of his disgust, his dismissal, was a fire that burned brighter than his apologies. She turned away, leading Zoe toward the ice cream stand, her resolve a shield against the past. Connor watched them disappear into the fading light, his heart a battleground of hope and despair. Zoe's laughter, her love for stars, was a glimpse of a life he could have had. But Simone's words, "We don't need you," were a truth he couldn't escape. He'd let his mother's lies destroy the woman he loved, and now her strength was a barrier he didn't know how to cross. He slipped the empty box from the star chart into his pocket, a small piece of his daughter he could hold on to, and walked away. The park's warmth a cruel contrast to the coldness in his soul. Simone felt his absence as she bought Zoe a cone, her daughter's joy a reminder of why she'd fought so hard. She'd survived Connor's betrayal, Evelyn's cruelty, and years of solitude. Zoe was her world, her reason. But as Zoe licked her ice cream, chattering about stars, a question gnawed at Simone's heart. Could she keep Connor at bay forever, when Zoe's smile seemed to call him back? The Atlanta Library hummed with quiet energy, its shelves a labyrinth of stories that seemed to mock the unspoken truths in Simone Brooks's heart. She stood by a window watching Zoe at the community science club, her daughter's small hands adjusting a model rocket with fierce concentration. The park's starlit moment lingered in Simone's mind. Zoe's joy over Connor's gift, the star chart that had stirred memories of a love she'd buried. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup, the warmth a frail shield against the storm within. Connor's presence, his persistent gifts, threatened the fortress she'd built for Zoe, and the echo of his long-ago venom, whore, gold digger, kept her walls high. She wouldn't let him unravel the life she'd fought for. Zoe's laughter broke her thoughts, a bright spark in the library's hush. "Mama, look! My rocket's gonna fly to Mars!" she called, holding up her creation. Simone smiled, her heart swelling with pride, but the ache beneath it was relentless. Maya's revelation, that Evelyn had silenced her attempt to tell Connor the truth, had cracked her certainty, suggesting he'd been as much a victim of his mother's lies as she was. But his words, his disgust, were a wound that refused to heal. She'd raised Zoe alone, a beacon of love in a world that tried to break her. Connor's reappearance couldn't change that. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Connor stepped into the library, his presence quiet but unmistakable, his jacket a stark contrast to the polished billionaire she'd seen in New York. Zoe spotted him, her eyes lighting up. "Mr. Connor!" she squealed, waving her rocket. Simone's stomach twisted, her instinct to pull Zoe away warring with the delight in her daughter's face. Connor knelt beside Zoe, his smile tentative. "That's a great rocket," he said, his voice soft. "Mind if I help?" Zoe nodded eagerly, handing him a piece of the model. "It needs to be strong for Mars," she said, her seriousness drawing a chuckle from him. Simone watched, her heart a battleground. Connor's hands, steady and careful, guided Zoe's as they adjusted the rocket's fins, their laughter mingling in a way that pricked at her. She remembered his touch, the way he'd once held her with that same care, whispering dreams under a starlit sky. But those dreams had shattered under his rage, his voice branding her a liar. She stepped forward, her voice clipped. "Zoe, it's time to go." But Zoe's plea stopped her. "Mama, just a little longer? Mr. Connor knows about Mars." Simone's throat tightened, the innocence in her daughter's voice a knife twisting in her chest. Connor stood, his eyes meeting hers, raw with a mix of hope and pain. "Simone, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low, urgent. She crossed her arms, her gaze cold. "I told you to stay away." But he pressed on, his words tumbling out. "I found my mother's journal. She wrote about you, how she hired someone to follow you after you left New York to make sure you never contacted me. She knew you were pregnant, Simone. She made sure I'd never know." His voice cracked, his hands trembling. "I didn't know about Zoe, I swear." The revelation hit like a wave, stealing Simone's breath. Her mind reeled, Evelyn's cold voice echoing. "Your blood will never taint our legacy." She'd known about Zoe, had orchestrated a web of lies to keep them apart. Simone's eyes burned, but she forced her voice steady. "And that changes what?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You believed her, Connor. You called me a whore, a gold digger trying to trap you. You looked at me like I was nothing, threw me out when I needed you most. I was alone, pregnant, and you broke me." Her words were a lash, each one carrying years of pain. Connor flinched, his face paling. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raw. "I let her poison me. I see it now, her lies, her control. But Simone, I loved you. I've never stopped." His confession was a plea, desperate and unguarded, but it only deepened the ache in her chest. She stepped closer, her voice low, venomous. You don't get to say that. You called me filth, told me to get out. I carried Zoe alone, built a life for her without you. Your regret doesn't erase that. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let tears fall. She'd cried enough for him. Zoe, oblivious, tugged at Connor's sleeve. You know about Mars, right? Mama says it's red. Connor's smile was strained, his gaze flicking to Simone. Yeah, it's red, he said, his voice soft. Your mama's smart. Zoe grinned, then ran back to her rocket, leaving the adults in a charged silence. Simone's heart raced, the library's warmth suffocating. She wanted to scream, to let the pain of those years spill out, but Zoe's presence tethered her. Stay away from her, she said, her voice ablaze. You don't get to play father now. Connor's eyes glistened, but he held her gaze. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I know I don't deserve it, but Zoe, she's mine too. I want to know her, Simone, please. The plea was a wound, reopening the scars she'd carried. She remembered the letter she'd written, left for him in their apartment, begging him to believe her. It had vanished, like her trust. You had your chance, she said, her voice final. You chose lies over me. She turned to Zoe, calling softly, Come on, baby, we're leaving. Zoe pouted but gathered her rocket, waving at Connor. Thanks for helping, mister. Her innocence was a dagger, cutting through both their hearts. Simone led her out, her steps steady despite the tremor in her chest. The library's quiet felt oppressive, Connor's words echoing. She knew you were pregnant. Evelyn's cruelty was a fresh betrayal, but it didn't erase Connor's. She'd fought too hard to let him back in, to risk Zoe's world for a man who'd shattered hers. Connor watched them go, the library's shelves closing in like a cage. Zoe's rocket, her laughter, her love for Mars, they were pieces of a life he'd been denied. He'd found his mother's journal by chance, hidden in her office, its pages detailing her ruthless campaign to erase Simone. The truth had gutted him, but Simone's pain, her voice trembling with years of hurt, was worse. He'd believed Evelyn's lies, let his anger destroy the woman he loved. Now Zoe's existence was a beacon, a chance he didn't deserve but couldn't let go. He sank into a chair, the journal's weight heavy in his memory. He wanted to be more than a stranger to Zoe, to know the girl who dreamed of Mars. But Simone's words, "You chose lies over me," were a verdict, a truth he couldn't escape. He'd broken her, and her strength, her refusal to yield, was a punishment he'd carry forever. The library's hum faded, leaving only the echo of Zoe's voice, a reminder of what he'd lost. Simone walked Zoe home, her daughter's hand warm in hers. The revelation about Evelyn burned, but it didn't change the past. Connor's face, his plea, stirred a flicker of doubt. Had he truly not known? But his words, whore, filth, were louder, a wound that defined her strength. She'd built a life for Zoe, a fortress of love. As Zoe chattered about rockets, Simone's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let Connor's regret weaken her, no matter how much her heart ached for what might have been. The Atlanta evening draped Simone Brooks's modest home in a quiet hush, the glow of fairy lights strung across the living room, casting soft shadows. Zoe's birthday party was in full swing, a simple affair with balloons bobbing against the ceiling and a homemade cake adorned with star-shaped candles. Simone stood by the counter, slicing fruit, her heart a tangle of pride and pain. The library encounter with Connor lingered like a bruise, his revelation about Evelyn's journal, her deliberate campaign to erase Simone, stirring a storm she couldn't quiet. His plea to know Zoe, his broken admission of regret, had cracked the edges of her resolve. But his long-ago words, whore, gold digger, were a fire that burned brighter, keeping her guard impenetrable. Zoe's laughter filled the room as she played tag with friends, her sweater catching the light with every twirl. "Mama, come play," she called, her voice a beacon of joy. Simone smiled, her daughter's happiness a lifeline against the turmoil within. "In a minute, baby," she said, her voice steady despite the ache. The star chart Connor had sent sat on a table, Zoe's pride and joy, its edges worn from her eager hands. Each gift from him, A book, a spaceship model, felt like a quiet invasion, chipping at the fortress Simone had built for her daughter. She wanted to protect Zoe from the pain she'd endured, but the spark in Zoe's eyes at Connor's gifts stirred a question she refused to face. Could her daughter have a father without shattering their world? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Maya slipped in, carrying a wrapped box. "From Connor," she said softly, her eyes apologetic. "He asked me to give it to Zoe." Simone's jaw tightened, her fingers pausing mid-slice. "He needs to stop," she said, her voice low, sharp. Maya set the box down, a model solar system gleaming through the wrapping. "He's trying, Simone," she said. "I know he hurt you, but he's not the man he was." Simone's laugh was bitter. "The man who called me a liar? Who threw me out when I needed him? That man's still in my head, Maya." Zoe bounded over, spotting the gift. "Is that for me?" she asked, eyes wide. Simone hesitated, then nodded, her heart twisting as Zoe tore open the wrapping, gasping at the planets. "Mama, look! It's the whole solar system!" Her joy was a knife, cutting through Simone's defenses. "Can we thank Mr. Connor?" Zoe asked, her innocence piercing. Simone's throat closed, the question a spark in dry grass. "He's busy, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "But I'm glad you like it." Zoe hugged the box, running to show her friends, leaving Simone with a weight she couldn't shake. She turned to Maya, her voice low. "Why do you keep helping him?" Maya's eyes softened. "Because I see what it's doing to you, holding on to that pain. He was wrong, Simone. But Evelyn manipulated him. He's trying to make it right." Simone's chest ached. The memory of Evelyn's journal, her calculated cruelty, mixing with Connor's venom. "You're a lying whore." "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "He believed her. He looked at me like I was nothing. I rebuilt my life for Zoe. He doesn't get to walk in now." Maya touched her arm. "I know, but Zoe's asking questions. She's smart. She'll wonder why he keeps showing up." The words struck deep, stirring a fear Simone had buried. Zoe deserved the truth, but how could she give it without reopening wounds? She glanced at her daughter, laughing as she spun a planet model, and felt a surge of protectiveness. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice firm. "I always have." Maya nodded, but her eyes held doubt, a silent plea for Simone to consider what she was shutting out. Alone later, as the party wound down, Simone sat by Zoe's cake, the candles long extinguished. She opened a letter tucked inside the gift box, Connor's handwriting stark against the page. "Simone, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I was wrong, blind, and I've carried that shame every day. Zoe's incredible, and that's because of you. I'll respect your boundaries, but I want to know her, to be there for her. I'm sorry for everything." Her fingers trembled, the words a mirror to his plea in the library. A part of her wanted to believe him, to see the man who'd once loved her in the gifts he sent Zoe. But his voice, filth, gold digger, was louder, a wound that defined her strength. She stood crossing to Zoe's room, where her daughter slept, clutching a tiny Jupiter model. Simone's heart swelled, but a question gnawed at her. Could she keep Zoe from the father who wanted her? She sat at her desk, pulling out a notebook, and began a letter she'd never send. "Zoe, one day you'll ask about your father. I want you to know I kept him away to protect you, to keep you safe from the pain he caused me. I love you enough for both of us." The words spilled out, a release of the pain she carried, but they didn't ease the ache. She folded the letter, tucking it away, her resolve hardening. Outside, under a street lamp's glow, Connor stood across from Simone's house, the party's light spilling through the windows. He'd wanted to knock, to see Zoe smile as she opened his gift, but Maya had warned him to stay back. Zoe's joy, her love for the stars, was a glimpse of a life he'd been denied. He'd found Evelyn's journal, read her cold calculations, and it had broken him. He'd let her lies destroy Simone, let his anger shatter their love. Now Simone's strength, her refusal to yield, was a punishment he deserved. But it didn't dull the longing to know his daughter. He clutched an old photo in his pocket, one of him and Simone under a starry sky, her laughter captured in the frame. He'd kept it, a relic of a love he'd lost. Zoe was a piece of that love, a chance to make things right. But Simone's words, "You don't get to walk in now," were a verdict. He turned away, the night swallowing him, the weight of his mistakes a shadow he couldn't outrun. Simone watched the last guest leave, the house falling quiet. She sat by Zoe's bed, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. The solar system model gleamed on the nightstand, a reminder of Connor's persistence. A part of her wanted to let him in, to give Zoe the father she deserved, but the memory of his disgust, "You're nothing," was a fire that burned brighter than his apologies. She'd built a life for Zoe, a fortress of love and pride. As she kissed Zoe's forehead, her resolve solidified. She was enough for her daughter, and no amount of regret could change the past. The stars outside twinkled, indifferent to the pain below. Simone closed her eyes, the letter's words echoing in her mind. She'd survived Connor's betrayal, Evelyn's cruelty, and years of solitude. Zoe was her world, her reason. But as she sat in the quiet, a question lingered, sharp and unyielding. Could she keep the truth from Zoe forever, when Connor's gifts carried a piece of the love she'd once known? The Atlanta Convention Center buzzed with anticipation, its high ceilings echoing with the chatter of young scientists as they presented their projects. Simone Brooks stood among the crowd, her heart swelling as Zoe stepped onto the stage, her small frame radiating confidence as she explained her model of a Martian rover. The room's energy was electric, but Simone's focus was singular. Her daughter, a beacon of brilliance in a world that had once tried to dim her own light. The memory of Zoe's birthday, with Connor's solar system gift and his letter of regret, lingered like a quiet ache. His words, "I'm sorry for everything," had stirred a storm in her, but the echo of his betrayal, whore, gold digger, kept her resolve unyielding. She'd built a life for Zoe, a fortress of love and pride, and she wouldn't let Connor's shadow breach it. Zoe's voice carried through the hall, clear and passionate, as she described how her rover could navigate Mars terrain. Simone clapped, her eyes glistening with pride, but a prickle of unease ran down her spine. She felt a familiar gaze, heavy and inescapable, from the back of the room. Connor stood there, half hidden in the crowd, his eyes fixed on Zoe with a mix of awe and pain. His presence was a jolt, stirring the same turmoil she'd felt at the birthday party. She turned her focus back to Zoe, determined to keep him at bay, but her heart betrayed her with a flicker of doubt. Could she shield Zoe from a father who so clearly longed for her? Connor's chest ached as he watched Zoe, her hands gesturing animatedly, her passion for the stars a mirror of his own. He'd come uninvited, drawn by a local article about the science fair, unable to resist seeing his daughter shine. The solar system model he'd sent had been a desperate gesture, a hope to connect, but Simone's silence, her refusal to open his letter, had been a verdict. He'd found more in his mother's files since the library encounter. Notes about paying off a private investigator to track Simone, ensuring she stayed silent. The truth had gutted him, but Simone's pain, "You called me filth," was a wound he'd inflicted, one he couldn't heal. Zoe finished her presentation, the crowd erupting in applause. Simone stepped forward, hugging her daughter tightly. "You were amazing, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Zoe beamed, clutching her ribbon. "Did you see, Mama? I told them about Mars." Simone's smile was a shield, hiding the storm within. She glanced toward the back of the room, catching Connor's eyes for a fleeting moment. His gaze was raw, pleading, but she turned away, leading Zoe through the crowd. She wouldn't let him in, not after the pain he'd caused, the years she'd carried alone. Connor watched them move, his heart a battleground of pride and despair. Zoe's brilliance, her love for Mars, was a glimpse of a life he'd been denied. He'd kept his distance since the birthday, respecting Simone's boundaries, but each step away from Zoe felt like losing her anew. He slipped a small book from his pocket, a guide to constellations, inscribed with a note. "For Zoe, from someone who believes in your dreams." He'd planned to leave it at the fair's gift table, a quiet offering, but seeing Simone's resolute profile stopped him. Her strength, her refusal to yield, was a punishment he deserved, yet it didn't dull his longing. Simone guided Zoe to a corner of the hall where other children showed off their projects. Can we look at the robot, Mama? Zoe asked, her excitement undimmed. Simone nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Connor's presence, a weight she couldn't shake. She remembered the letter she'd written to Zoe, never sent, pouring out her pain. I kept him away to protect you. It had been a release, a way to hold on to her strength. But seeing him now, his eyes soft with pride for Zoe, stirred a question she'd buried. Could Zoe have a father without reopening her wounds? She pushed it down, her jaw tightening. His betrayal, "You're a lying whore," was a scar that defined her resilience. A familiar voice broke her thoughts. Maya approached, her expression cautious. "He's here, isn't he?" she asked, glancing toward Connor. Simone nodded, her voice low. "He doesn't give up." Maya's eyes softened. "I saw him outside your house that night, after Zoe's birthday. He was crying, Simone. He knows what he lost." The words hit like a wave, stirring a flicker of empathy Simone didn't want. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice sharp. "He chose his mother's lies. He called me nothing. I won't let that pain touch Zoe." Maya sighed, touching her arm. "I know. But Zoe's starting to ask questions. She's smart. She'll see him in herself one day." Simone's chest tightened, Maya's words echoing her deepest fear. Zoe deserved the truth, but how could she give it without unraveling everything? She looked at her daughter, laughing with a friend over a robot display, and felt a surge of protectiveness. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice firm. "I always have." But as she spoke, her eyes caught Connor's again, a brief collision that sent her heart racing. He held the book, his fingers tracing the cover, as if it were a lifeline to Zoe. She turned away, her resolve a fortress, but a crack had formed, small but undeniable. Connor lingered at the hall's edge, the book heavy in his hands. He wanted to walk over, to give it to Zoe himself, to see her smile light up at the stars. But Simone's gaze, fleeting but fierce, stopped him. He'd destroyed her trust, let Evelyn's lies poison their love. The journal, the investigator, the years of manipulation. He saw it all now, but too late. Zoe was his daughter, a truth he felt in his bones. But Simone's strength, her refusal to let him in, was a wall he couldn't climb. He placed the book on the gift table, the note a whisper of his heart, and stepped back, the crowd swallowing him. Simone watched him go, her heart a tangle of anger and ache. The book caught her eye, its cover gleaming under the lights. She didn't pick it up, didn't read the note, but its presence was a weight. She remembered nights with Connor, naming stars, dreaming of a future that never came. Those dreams had died under his rage, his mother's cruelty. She'd rebuilt her life for Zoe, a sanctuary of love and pride. Yet as Zoe ran to her, ribbon in hand, a question lingered. Could she keep the truth from her daughter forever, when Connor's quiet offerings carried pieces of a past she couldn't erase? She knelt, hugging Zoe tightly. "You're my star, baby," she whispered, her voice thick. Zoe grinned, oblivious to the storm in her mother's heart. "Can we go home, Mama?" Simone nodded, leading her out, the convention center's buzz fading. Connor's silhouette lingered in her mind, his pride for Zoe a mirror to her own. But his betrayal, "You're nothing," was louder, a fire that fueled her strength. She'd survived him, built a life without him. As they stepped into the night, the stars above twinkled, indifferent to the choices below. But Simone's resolve held firm. She was enough for Zoe, and that was all that mattered. As the stars fade over Simone and Zoe's journey, their tale of resilience and unyielding love leaves echoes in our hearts. What did you feel as Simone stood firm, guarding her daughter from a past that wounded her? Did Connor's regret stir your sympathy, or did his choices seal his fate? Share your thoughts. Your voice brings this story to life. Thank you for walking this emotional path with us, for feeling every heartbeat of pain and pride. Stay tuned for more stories that tug at the soul, and we'll meet again under a new constellation of tales.